I'm Bill Brown, Director of the Australia Institute's Democracy and Accountability Program. Welcome to this edition of Australia's biggest book club. I'm coming to you from the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. Sovereignty was never ceded. I would like to pay my respects to the keepers of country and culture here and around Australia. Just a reminder that you can register for upcoming book clubs and all our webinars at australiainstitute.org.au/webinars. You can type in questions for our panelists using the Q&A box, and you can upvote other questions too. Please keep things civil and on topic in the chat, or we will kick you out. Finally, this is a live event and it is being recorded. The video will be available on our website at australiainstitute.org.au. We're joined by lawyer and author Josh Bornstein to discuss his new book, Working for the Brand. Working for the Brand tells the story of how corporations are destroying free speech, weakening governments, undermining democracies, and repressing workers. Josh Bornstein is an award-winning lawyer specializing in employment and labor relations law. He has successfully sued a lot of badly behaved corporations, cornered the market in representing sacked rabbis, and acted for employees who were sacked for expressing political views. His articles and essays have appeared in Australia's major media outlets, and he is a contributing author to The Wages Crisis in Australia, What It Is and What to Do About It, published in 2018. He is a member of the Australia Institute's board and of the advisory board of the Centre for Employment and Labour Relations Law at the University of Melbourne. He is also a member of a sports disciplinary tribunal. Josh, the book has many examples of corporations being sensitive about their brand or reputation. Can you explain for us both what goes into a corporate brand and whether it's only for-profit companies that manage their brands?
Good questions. My book argues that as corporations through what I call the neoliberal era started to behave in more harmful ways, they started to harm the environment, reduce payment of tax, engaged in elaborate tax minimisation and tax evasion schemes, and sought to deunionize the labour market and remove collective bargaining. And in many ways, they did that through outsourcing. A lot of jobs went overseas and were fractured into more precarious types of work. As that process unfolded, a renewed emphasis on developing shiny, happy, lovely, ethereal brands developed. Brands like Virgin started to become master brands where you could apply them across all sorts of businesses. The whole notion of branding changed. And one of the key arguments in the book is that as this behavior deteriorated, corporations used branding as a form of ethics washing. They sought to, in order to counter all of the harmful conduct and mask it to some extent and try and retain their social license, they started to portray themselves as ethical and in some cases as activists for progressive causes. My book views that sort of process with a cynical lens, because I don't think you can, on the one hand, as a corporation, stop paying your fair share of tax and legitimately assert that you're a responsible member of the community. And tax is, of course, as we famously know, the price of civilization. If you start to take an axe to civilization and decimate civilization, then I'm very cynical about you presenting your corporation as an ethical institution. This all occurred in an era of neoliberal concentration of wealth, concentration of market power. There's now many industries dominated by monopolies and oligopolies, and a huge transfer of wealth away from workers to shareholders, and also I would argue power away from workers to corporations and away from consumers to corporations. You can't be doing all of that and be an ethical institution. They're just incompatible.
And you mentioned Milton Friedman kind of in the early days of neoliberalism arguing that a company exists to pursue profit and shouldn't concern itself with other issues. We kind of have the worst of both worlds
Exactly. I mean, a lot of he argued. I sort of agree with him. Companies are set up to, the big companies we're talking about, the multinational corporations, they're profit-seeking missiles. You can, and they rolled out, contrary to Milton Friedman's urging, he was very skeptical about this, corporate social responsibility programs. And I discuss this at some length in the book because they're the forerunner to ESG and other programs we now see. But corporate social responsibility programs existed alongside all of the terrible, harmful conduct I complain about and I describe in the book. And after 40 years of corporate social responsibility, until it really was declared dead by one of its champions, Lord John Browne, former CEO of BP, who I think declared it dead in 2015, corporate social responsibility existed alongside all of the harm I talk about, the transfer of wealth, power, environmental degradation, decimation of tax. Corporate social responsibility was at its zenith. And some of the companies that were heralded as champions of corporate social responsibility, including BP, I discuss the harm that they cause to the environment. They still claim to be a green company, and it's nonsense. And even Volkswagen, I think, was an example I use in the book of winning the Corporate Social Responsibility Business Award 2 years before it was exposed famously for illegally cheating carbon emissions testing on its vehicles, which resulted in huge class actions, huge multi-billion-dollar penalties. So it was regarded as, a champion of corporate social responsibility at the same time as it was trying to cheat climate change mitigation strategies and tests on its vehicles.
Now you talk also in the book kind of about a corporation's desire to protect its brand negatively affecting employees. So do you have some examples of when employees supposedly negatively affected the corporate brand and what the corporate response was?
So what's happened is we've seen the rise of corporate branding, the rise of corporate power, and along comes the internet. And as we all know now, the internet promised free speech without limit, and everybody could amplify their voice on social media. And what we've seen that I describe in the book is the grim ritual now where an employee says or does something controversial. It is then attacked by a group online, sometimes an angry mob. I use the example of Scott McIntyre from SBS early on in the book, who tweeted criticisms of Anzac Day. He was attacked by a group of Murdoch journalists online. They then pressured coalition MPs and a mob developed. Everyone pressured the Minister for Communications at that time, who was Malcolm Turnbull, to get him sacked. Malcolm Turnbull contacted the head of SBS, and Scott McIntyre's career at SBS was over, and his life, as I describe in the book, has never been the same. So it's a brutal process, and the corporation in that situation often will say, we're taking action to uphold our company values, because all of the companies I describe who behave in incredibly harmful ways profess on their websites to aspire to values of integrity, decency, transparency, accountability, respect. these are standards that they impose on their employees, not just when they're at work, but increasingly outside work. So what's happened, if you follow that logic, when you go to work, you don't just exchange a wage for your labour, you're exchanging a wage for foregoing your democratic rights. Not to, effectively, you're being asked to sell your right to say or do something that might be controversial outside work. And that's a deeply repressive transaction, morally questionable, philosophically dubious. But it's part of, I think, the huge transfer of power away from employees to corporations that we've seen through the last 40 or 50 years. And it's really at the heart of my argument that the corporation is now a deeply undemocratic institution, which has grown too big and too powerful and is out of control.
I'm curious about this kind of intersection where, as citizens of a liberal democracy, we wouldn't allow our rights to be impeded by our government. We seem to sign up to autocratic control from companies much more readily. Is that, you think, mostly a function of the increased corporate power that they have, or are there other reasons why we kind of sign these rights away?
I think it's a complicated issue, a number of different threads. It's a sign of the power. I've witnessed this in my career because for many years I did union cases and I tried to fight the good fight against deunionisation with trade unions. And then as the labour market, as the companies started to win, I started to act for more individuals and look at the terms of their contracts, and contracts appear on my desk every week in my day job. And the contracts became more and more onerous, autocratic and repressive as the collective voice of employees was crushed. Individuals just signed up to whatever was presented to them. For many individuals, they don't realise what they've signed up to. So a lot of employees don't know they're signing up to such a commitment because it's buried in the fine print, like a commercial contract, which if you had the time and a very expensive lawyer, you might try and get to the bottom of. And employment contracts now become like that because it also incorporates a range of policies which you're not even presented with when you sign. So I think there's that element to it. I think some employees have bought into the idea that corporations are a force for good. And so that complicates the picture as well. But ultimately, it's an assertion of power and control that, as you say, no citizen would ever accept from a democratic government. We would never accede to the notion that the Albanese government could require each of us not to say or do anything controversial, or not to say or do anything that the government thinks is harmful to its reputation. That would be insane. We'd be out on the streets. But that's what we sign up to when we go to work. And I'm trying to highlight how dangerous that is.
And an example that comes up with Scott McIntyre is that it may have been offered in a contract by one employer, but in practice, if you want to work as a sports journalist, you've got a limited pool of people, a limited pool of employers. You may well find the same conditions.
So the amazing things about contracts of employment is how similar they are. And their terms are often borrowed from one another. So sometimes you'll see a new term come into a contract in one company and all of a sudden it appears and spreads throughout the labour market. There's a trend to HR, to employment conditions and so on. And so the contract or the bargain I talk about is now almost universal. When you go to work, you'll be signed up to a code of conduct, a whole suite of policies, including a social media policy, and the actual terms of the contract itself. Buried in the fine print will be an obligation you have not to say or do anything controversial, particularly on social media, and two, to comply with the code of conduct and all the company's values. in my book, I argue that a company can't have values. A company, only humans can actually really have values. The notion that a company can have values is an oxymoron. And so the other instructive thing about the deal that we sign up to is in the fine print, it'll say you're obliged to comply with all of these values and standards. We're not, because they know they can't. The trick with requiring us to is we can't either. Not everybody, sorry, I'll start again. No one can always, on a 24/7 basis, be fair, decent, respectful all the time. I just don't think that's a realistic. We might want to, we might aspire to, but we're all fallible. And these contracts literally read, brook no humanity, no fallibility. They seek to sanitize their workplace of our humanity and our mistakes. And that, again, is deeply repressive.
It struck me that it really is this lack of reciprocity that the company demands from its employees. For example, you give an example of anti-bullying policy
Yep.
that's kind of deployed as a weapon rather than a shield for employees.
Yes. So the legal reason companies have buried in the fine print of all their contracts that they're not bound by their own values is because way back in 2008, I think in Canberra, an employee sued Goldman Sachs, I think it was, or JB Weir, over failing to apply its bullying policy, and won. As soon as that happened, the word went out amongst the lawyers and the corporates and the HR departments. Oh my God, we've been sued for breaching a policy. This can't be allowed to happen in the future. How do we make sure this never happens again? And so now contracts have been rewritten to make sure companies never get sued for their breaching their own policies.
And the inconsistent enforcing of brand protection. You use an example of Qantas, which has suffered a fair bit of brand damage in the last few years.
Yes.
None of it caused by employees tweeting recklessly.
Yeah.
Who was responsible for the brand damage and what happened to them?
So Qantas is a great example in Australia. Qantas is effectively a monopoly in aviation, oligopoly in some markets, monopoly in others. When it gets into trouble, we bail it out. The taxpayer supports it because aviation is quite volatile. So there's an implicit guarantee that the taxpayer and the government will rescue it, like we did during COVID. When it inevitably, as it does, rebounds and makes lots of money, it's a feeding frenzy for shareholders. We don't benefit from any of the support we give it. It's under Alan Joyce's stewardship, it ruthlessly sought to cut costs. It sacked about 40% of its securely employed employees and replaced them with insecure labour. It paid very little tax. It got a lot of tax benefits on the other side. And all the while, Alan Joyce marketed and branded himself and the company as a social justice warrior. And including through his involvement in same-sex marriage. But as we've seen in recent years, the gloss started to come off as a result of successive scandals involving the illegal sacking of 1,700 baggage handlers, the sale of non-existent tickets on flights during COVID, and also the COVID situation resulted in people being unable to access their flights, and they had a redemption scheme which you couldn't actually operate. So people couldn't get their money back or access to a flight because Qantas made it so difficult. And so in many ways, it's the quintessential Australian example of what I talk about, which is companies parading as ethical or as progressive, particularly on social issues, while masking their illegal and deeply unethical behaviour, and seeking to continue to enjoy the benefits of neoliberalism. That is, much greater wealth, much greater power, monopoly markets, continued environmental degradation, and fending off what should happen, which is we need to properly regulate them. And I give an example. Qantas responded when a union delegate raised safety concerns about, during the COVID lockdowns, about planes coming in from China. He was immediately stood down pending a disciplinary investigation into whether he'd breached the company's policies and values by alerting his colleagues to potential safety risks. Thankfully, in that case, Qantas was prosecuted and for breaching criminal laws and was found guilty. But all too often, the corporations that we're talking about, that I'm dealing with, that we're describing, or I describe in the book, are poorly regulated, increasingly powerful, and increasingly repressive and harmful in our lives.
You mentioned the kind of intersection of social media, a mob reaction, media amplifying it. One thing I hadn't realized until reading the book was that you yourself were the victim of quite a scary and intense cancel culture campaign after an article with your byline on it appeared on a website. Can you tell us more about that and how it influenced your thinking on this?
Sure. I mean, I had a slightly different experience of the harm of the internet. I mean, this is another good example of corporations, probably the social media companies, if not the most powerful corporations in the world, they're pretty close to it, who are out of control because we're seeing every day, every month, every year, new harms appearing, and we don't know how to regulate to manage them. But my experience goes back to 2015 when I was targeted by someone who wanted to hurt me. This wasn't just about trying to get me sacked. This was about either getting me physically harmed or worse, because of my advocacy about racial discrimination laws. At that time, there was a debate about whether Australia's racial discrimination laws and 18C would be watered down by the Abbott government. I think it was maybe 2013, and I was very active online in defending those laws. Unbeknownst to me, someone took great exception to my advocacy and then set about harming me. And they did that in a very strange and terrible way. They impersonated me, applied to become a blogger on quite a well-known Israeli newspaper on the other side of the world, which I'd never heard of at that time, called the Times of Israel. They used a number of articles. They were granted blogger status. They then posted under my name with my photo articles that I had written for The Guardian previously. So they repurposed my old Guardian articles, one a week for the 4 weeks. And then on the 5th week, they posted an article that I hadn't written, which turned into a diatribe against Palestinians and called for their extermination. And so this occurred on the other side of the world while I was asleep, and I woke up to a phone full of death threats and chaos. And that was just the beginning of a pretty traumatic 6 months. And ultimately, the person who was doing this not only impersonated me, but had 10 online personalities and accounts, some of which debated one another, attacked one another, or agreed with one another. And one of them was regarded as a serious security threat because they were regarded as an ISIS operative. And that account incited a terrorist attack in America where 2 people were shot dead, and then incited ISIS to attack me. And that was terrifying. And I talk about the experience of the police trying to wrestle with the big tech companies to get information and how powerless they were, and losing all faith that the police knew what was happening and had the situation under control. They kept telling me they were about to make an imminent arrest of someone in Australia, and then there was no one arrested. I lost complete faith in that. I my health started to suffer. I couldn't look at my phone because I just got bombarded with threats in multiple languages. There was a post on Twitter, a fake Josh Bornstein appeared on Twitter, a new account calling, and it was sponsored. So a special tweet which gets elevated status if you pay for sponsorship at Twitter, which called for the death of all Muslims. Again, another flurry of death threats and horror. So ultimately, a journalist and a law student, an SBS journalist and a law student who were tracking this whole process, pieced together clues about the person's identity, worked out the person was in Florida, had caused all this harm, had also incited a terrorist attack in Melbourne. There's a lot of harm this person caused, and then went to the AFP, who went to the FBI, and an arrest was made as that person was in the process of helping build a bomb for another attack on a ceremony in America. That person's now in jail. So it's a pretty wild story. Had a very big impact on my life for 6 months, but I think the effects of it will always be with me because it was very traumatic. And I saw what it was like to be in the Colosseum, if you like, being condemned all over the world for something I hadn't done. So it also helped inform my thoughts about social media, the Colosseum, the companies that operate social media, which promised, greater democracy, free information, beautiful free speech, are actually paradoxically creating immense harm, and something that we really haven't quite grappled with as a society and as nation states. They really haven't grappled with all the harm and how to properly regulate it.
Thank you. You write in the book about Donald Trump's solicitation of donations from oil and gas companies, and also Republican cancel culture, including by legislating and things like book bans.
Yes.
This week, Donald Trump became the president-elect of the United States of America. What do you think the implications are for both workers' rights and democracy more generally?
Pretty devastating. I think America has elected its first fascist president. And if you subscribe to that view, then it's going to have a devastating impact on all sorts of democratic institutions. And I include trade unions as part of that architecture, if you like. I argue in the book that I really try and address cancel culture and free speech, and whether cancel culture exists. I debate all of that. And I argue in the book that the greatest threat to free speech and the greatest exponent of cancel culture is the authoritarian and fascist right. They use the power of the Murdoch press. They use the power of government, like Trump will do, and others are already doing. Orban in Europe, other countries which have moved in an authoritarian or fascist direction. And I compare that to the debates and arguments about progressive left-wing cancel culture, which often is focused on universities and the arts and media to some extent. One is a Humvee and one's an electric scooter. So yes, there is an issue in the left, I think, and I wrestled with that a lot because I am of the left and I want to support fights against inequality. But I think some of the arguments in the left, particularly about gender inequality, race inequality, what is broadly called identity politics, are prosecuted in such a way that it's splintering some of the solidarity that's needed with the victims of economic inequality, particularly working class people. We need to find a way on our side of the political spectrum to restore some solidarity between everybody who suffers economic inequality and social inequality. And I try and navigate what are very difficult ethical, philosophical issues, and end up, I think, arguing for a form of liberal democratic theory. I am not a supporter of unlimited free speech, and I believe in proper limits to free speech. The best method of determining whether speech crosses that harmful threshold is a democratic method. In other words, through the political process and government consideration in a democracy. That's going to be torn apart by Trump. But possibly one of the worst ways in which we can determine what are the proper bounds of speech and its relationship with harm is through corporate brand management. Because ultimately, the determination there is this good for the brand or is it not good for the brand? And the brand will always seek to minimize controversy. Even if Alan Joyce is reorienting Qantas into a business model which involves illegal conduct, he won't get in trouble for any brand damage. But if an individual employee says something about Anzac Day or the flag or nationalism or whatever it might be, or even a bad joke, I talk about examples of bad jokes in the book causing people to lose their jobs, then the corporation and the brand will be ruthless.
That brings me neatly to my last question before we move to audience questions. And just a reminder for those watching, you can put your questions in the message block and we'll consider them. But for me, in the book, you ask the question, why is it that those who are being screwed by wealth inequality, stagnating wages, housing crises, and an angry climate are seemingly ignoring the role of big business in their suffering? And what conclusions do you come to and what can be done about it?
So this is going to be interesting because I think there's an age distinction here. There are, among people under 35, I find quite a lot of resistance to the idea that corporate social responsibility, in fact, isn't all that meaningful. There is a much more, there's a much greater willingness amongst many younger people. I may be wrong, I hope I'm wrong, but to drink the Kool-Aid about corporate brand management, if I can put it that way. That's one challenge. I don't quite understand why. And then on the other hand, with workers who have been the victim of the sorts of shifts I talk about in the book, who have lost jobs, or whose wages have been depressed, whose industries have been shut down, they're not turning their anger towards corporations. They're increasingly being attracted to authoritarian, hyper-masculine political figures, as we see in Europe in particular and the States. And if we knew the answer to why all of these things were happening and the way to get out of it, I would be a very successful progressive politician, I suspect. No one quite has figured that out. But at least in the book, I suggest that one part of the puzzle is that middle-class progressives like me aren't focusing as much attention on the needs of a challenging economic inequality as we are on race and gender in particular, and those forms of inequality, and that some of the ways in which we prosecute social inequality are very, I think, isolating or very difficult for workers to respond to. They don't understand intersectionality, for example. I think 98% of the Australia's population wouldn't have a sound understanding of what intersectionality is. And so the way it's prosecuted is excluding a lot of other people who should be part of the conversation. And there needs to be a greater attempt to find solidarity and synthesis between everybody who's challenged by inequality. But if I ever get the magic formula, I will not be shy about sharing it.
Thank you, Josh. We have a question about from Jerry about kind of what is a corporation, and are we talking about firms of any size, and what about not-for-profits or universities or that kind of thing?
Yes. Okay. So good question. The focus of my critique is on big corporations, okay? Multinationals who over the last 40 years, globalization has seen them navigate international markets in ways that were rarer than previously. Technology has also allowed them to expand. And neoliberal politics has reduced regulation and allowed them to accrue greater wealth and power. Such is the economic, cultural, political power of corporations now that many of their mores have infected other entities, including universities. So it's a commonly heard critique of universities that they've been corporatized. And there's a chapter in the book dealing with what happens when corporate brand management, which is now practiced by almost all universities, clashes with academic freedom, which is a very important part of the book because that's the only part of the labour market where there has been some success in resisting corporate brand management and free speech in the form of academic freedom being able to survive. But we even see corporations and corporate brand management infecting public institutions. The ABC, I would say, had that suffered from that malaise. The public sector has been diminished over many decades as the big four have come in and other consultants have been brought in to try and give it more of a private sector method. I'm not in the book addressing not-for-profits. They're a different type of entity. It's really the great benefactors of the neoliberal transformation, which is big business. Even small businesses have been harmed by this concentration of market power. And we see that every day with supermarkets and producers trying to sell their product and not being able to bargain with them and having their prices diminished.
Thank you. Leanne asks, can you talk about John Stuart Mill and his concept of freedom, which so many free speech advocates quote? And I might add to that kind of the distinction you identified before about legislated limits on speech versus corporate imposed limits.
Sure. I mean, excellent question. So John Stuart Mill and Voltaire are often invoked by conservatives who portray themselves as champions of free speech. I spent a lot of time saying that most conservatives are free speech frauds because the moment they've enunciated their commitment to free speech, in the next sentence, they will try and get someone sacked or punished for some questioning of the status quo, or some progressive, controversial statement. There's many, many examples. I mean, Trump claims he's a free speech warrior. Erica Betts would claim he's a free speech warrior. All of the people who hunt down and mob progressives who get into trouble on the internet claim to be free speech warriors. Mill and Voltaire did not advocate a libertarian free-for-all. They were very conscious that some categories of speech needed to be limited, and Mill developed what was called the harm principle. And that's really what has guided liberal democracies in trying to determine the bounds of free speech, or what is okay to speak and what's harmful. And just so we're clear, Australians enjoy free speech except if it's only to the extent that it's constrained by our laws. Sexual harassment laws constrain free speech, bullying laws do, intellectual property laws, defamation laws, deceptive and misleading conduct laws that protect consumers constrain free speech. These are all laws that have gone through Parliament, through a democratic process where you get some deliberation. Racial discrimination laws, all the anti-discrimination laws. I'm all in favour of that. But increasingly, as corporations become more powerful and started to overshadow government, they are arrogating the right to determine these difficult issues. We saw this in Israel Folau, very difficult issues raised there. And the government is out of the picture, and it's the corporation in a brand management crisis that is usually executing the employee.
We have a question from Tim here. When corporations embrace socially progressive branding, does it open an avenue to get around traditional considerations for fair or unfair dismissal? So not about poor performance or bad process, but about the notional safety of other workers or customers?
Oh, that's a very difficult question. Unfair dismissal, here's a jaundiced view of unfair dismissal. Having practiced in this area for way too many years, for at least 25 years, unfair dismissal laws are now very weak. But what they are supposed to protect is a proper process and a proper consideration of whether there was a valid reason for the sacking that's not harsh or unjust in all of the circumstances. It's corporate brand management sometimes comes into unfair dismissal when someone posts online. So there's cases that have dealt with controversial posts, criticising the fast food outlet when you work for the fast food outlet, cases about conduct outside work and whether that should be a basis for being sacked. So to the extent that there's any engagement with unfair dismissal law, it's really in that realm. So some cases have said if you criticise your boss on social media, bad luck, you're gone. Others have said, why can't you do that? And some cases have said out of hours conduct should be irrelevant, and others have taken the opposite position. But more fundamentally, it's a very weak protection now because it's been decimated by legislative, sort of adverse legislative changes that make most cases settle for very little. It's very hard to get reinstated, and it's your last resort if you're dealing with a legal challenge.
Makes sense. Claire asks, any comments on the curious historical fact that a corporation is a person? And I might add, and what kind of person is it if it is a person?
Correct. So another cracking question. Corporations have status as what we call corporate personality. That just means they can act through the corporation, they can sue or be sued. They have an identity as an entity. But where you see people trying to humanize corporations, you should be very, very skeptical. And because trying to humanize a corporation and suggest they're just like you or I is usually a technique used in the dark arts of brand management. And to try and align or support the idea that what's good for the corporation is good for us. All of this brand management is really aimed at fending off proper regulation that would make sure that we don't have markets dominated by monopolies and oligopolies, that we do have proper tax paid by corporations, that we do protect the environment from the harm that's being caused in horrific ways at the moment, and that employees get a fair wage. When you hear someone talking about a corporation in the sense that it's a human, they're trying to fend off all of those things. That would mean they're properly regulated. That's an old technique that keeps being reinvented. It's been going for at least 100 years.
That dovetails nicely with a question we have about the proper regulation of social media companies in particular. And Louise asks about the implications of the misinformation bill. So who are those who'll be selected to fact check information?
Yes, I mean, we're wrestling with this all the time, but can I just take that question and give you a broad answer? Unless those companies are way too big and way too powerful and should be broken up. And one of the tragedies of the recent result in America is that Joe Biden and his administration were doing more to try and break up big tech companies and big monopolies than any other administration for many, many decades. We're living in the second Gilded Age. We don't talk about it, but we are, where big corporations now have way too much power. And the biggest challenge is the big tech companies. Until we can find a way to make those companies pay for the harm they're causing, they will continue to cause chaos, dysfunction, disinformation, misinformation, violence, all the terrible consequences we see because they make money out of it. We have to turn that on its head. And I advocate that the best way to do that, or one of the methods that should be used, because there should be many different approaches tried on these monster companies, is to impose on those corporations a duty of care to all users of social media, so that if you're a user of social media and you suffer harm because of what's on social media and it's the algorithms that propel it, then you can take legal action to recover compensation. That's how we started to clean up workplaces when we first introduced workplace laws, where once upon a time, if you lost an arm in an American abattoir in an accident, you were just sacked. When that changed, we introduced a duty of care. That needs to happen to social media companies. And in the end, I'm again more inclined to trust a government to regulate harmful conduct and decide what's harmful and what's not harmful, or what's misinformation and what's not misinformation, than leave it to a free-for-all of a monopoly that's out of control.
We have a question from Paul. He's saying, how do you grapple with corporate brand management when someone's public statements might be entirely antithetical to the employer's central mission? So public service needing to remain apolitical is the main example, but For example, homophobes working for pro-LGBT organisations, political staffers, journalists, etc.
Yeah, look, those are questions about largely organisations which I don't talk about in the book, but there are certainly organisations, if you're working for the Australia Institute, for example, which is not really what I address in the book, and it's pushing its research or publicising its research. If you're out there undermining its research, then you're really out undermining its central reason for being. The public sector, and I think that's a different issue. The public sector, again, there are restrictions on public servants. They are, I think, over the top, but they're at least legislated through a democratic process. They don't extend as far as many of the more capricious, repressive harm that corporations get involved in, but they do, I think, have a chilling impact on public servants. You can at least argue, there is an argument that impartiality is in aid of democracy. And whereas I think corporate brand management is antithetical to democracy, but I concede there are different issues in the public domain. And again, in public broadcasting, the more sort of public interest organisations you get, the further away you get from my critique. But I concede there are restrictions on all sorts of people in the labour market. But I start from the basic view that for democracy, we need to have as many people able to participate in debate, dissent, demonstrations as possible to have a healthy democracy. And if we're going to limit people's rights to do that, then we have to do it very carefully and to a minimum. Now, we'll get to the question about what if a corporation is pro-diversity and inclusion and someone like Israel Folau comes along. And I think I should just address it by reference to that case. That raised a really difficult issue because here you had a guy who goes to a fundamentalist church, which the state supports, who preaches parts of the Bible which are homophobic, and who then goes and shares some of that on social media. He's a fundamentalist Christian. And we have laws which say you can't be sacked or harmed because you're of a certain religion. And then we have, on the other hand, the right of the queer community to live free from vilification, discrimination, and so on, which I fully support. I think his views are ridiculous. The right of the queer community wasn't protected by federal law when that happened. His right to religion was protected. What worried me most about that debate was that the progressives, who I usually align with, weren't saying, they were calling for him to be sacked in many cases. Not all queer people did, but a lot of progressives and queer community called for his sacking, not because his speech was harmful, but because he breached his employment contract, which horrified me. This is a contract, this is a document which is deeply repressive to employee rights. And if you apply that logic, then Ros Ward, who worked at La Trobe and posted a rainbow flag, should be sacked as well because she breached the employment contract. Scott McIntyre criticised Anzac Day and, hyper-masculine nationalism, should have been sacked because he breaches the employment contract. And you really decimate labour rights, and you also decimate a lot of other progressives, which is the sort of splintering I'm talking about that I'm trying to avoid on our side of the fence. There may be a really good reason to legislate to stop the comments that people like Folau make. And I'd be very supportive of the Parliament trying to address that. Every time the Parliament tries, they choke. They withdraw from the field and say it's too hard. But the worst possible environment for this to occur is in the corporate world, as I keep saying. And just bear in mind, although I think his comments were stupid, I couldn't even take them seriously. But others said, no, they're actually very harmful. His punishment means by sacking him and saying you can't go to work if you have those views and prosecute those views publicly, that would disqualify him from working in virtually every company in Australia. And we saw him go offshore. That also seems to me to be an incredibly disproportionate punishment. We don't apply that sort of punishment to all sorts of other transgressions, often much more serious, than putting on Facebook a pretty ridiculous quote sourced from the Bible.
Josh, we've got time for one more question. It's from Jason. He says, "Thank you for mapping out the problem in your book. It seems like you're setting things up for a sequel, which maps out the solutions. You've mentioned some of those, unions and better regulation of tech companies. But apart from pushing back on NDAs, taking codes of conduct from employers to task, can you elaborate on the next steps of rectifying the problems identified in your book?"
It's really, this is in your bailiwick. This is really a democratic struggle. I think corporations now have undermined democracy. They have gamed the political system. They now wield more power than many nation states. And we're seeing the devastating results of inequality that they've produced in some of the most scary regressions to autocracy and fascism we've seen for decades. We, on our side of the fence, need to find a way to restore solidarity. We have the numbers. That's one thing corporations don't do. If we're united, the people who are disadvantaged by corporate power and inequality can outnumber them, but we're splintered. So that's point one. We've been here before. Corporations wielded this power in what was called the First Gilded Age, early 1900s, in America, the Belle Epoque in Europe. What transformed that era and brought it to an end was exposing their harm and then legislating to regulate them properly and tame them. That's absolutely necessary. So it requires us to rehabilitate taxation, government, democracy of the people. Secondly, I don't think you can have a healthy democracy and tame corporate power unless you have a healthy union movement. And we've started to look at that in Australia. The Albanese government pushed through some very good laws which started to restore employee bargaining power, but there's a long way to go to redress 40 years of adversity. And union density is still way, way too low to actually moderate the power of business. Once you moderate the power of business in the workplace, you make the workplace more democratic. That bleeds into the broader democracy, but you also moderate its wealth. And that is another source of power. So it really comes down to applying the lessons of the First Gilded Age in the Second Gilded Age, albeit I think it's a lot harder now because we're dealing with multinational monsters.
Thank you, Josh. And even on a personal note, joining your union could give you access to legal advice about a contract, support in negotiating with an employer.
All of that and a lot more. And at the moment, unions are wrestling with a very big problem, which is the legal system has been designed to discourage union membership by saying, if you don't join a union, you still get all the benefits. So we have what's called a big freeloader problem, where 10 or 15% of the population are funding the unions, but the benefit is going to the other 85%. And until that changes, it's going to be a real struggle because we need to encourage people to join, not discourage them.
Look, we'll have to wrap it up there. Please, everyone on the call, thank Josh Bornstein. Thank you, Josh, so much for
Thank you for your excellent questions, and I've really enjoyed talking to you.
Okay. And thank you, everyone, for coming along. The next edition of Australia's Biggest Book Club is coming up on Friday, 6 December. Alice Grundy will be speaking to George Melo-Genis about his new quarterly essay, Minority Report. If you're interested in the Australia Institute's research, you can find it all at australiainstitute.org.au. Don't forget to subscribe to the Australia Institute on YouTube and to our podcasts, Follow the Money, Dollars and Cents, and our new series, After America. Make sure you check out Working for the Brand. Thanks for tuning in. See you again soon. Thanks again, Josh.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoy our videos, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell button to get notified when we publish a new one. See you next time.